Well, we're now in the second half of September, and the Atlantic Cabo Verde hurricane season isn't quite ready to go away just yet. Let's start by recapping where we are at this point, because the last month has been quite a busy time. It's our climatological peak of the hurricane season, of course, but even so, we've had 10 named storms form since August 20th, starting with Emily over here in the eastern tropical Atlantic and culminating most recently in the currently active Hurricane Nigel. This has, of course, also included some particularly powerful storms that we've discussed, at least in their genesis stages, storms like Hurricane Lee, which was a Category 5 storm, as well as powerful Hurricane Idalia, which impacted portions of Florida. This was kind of the big story about a couple of weeks ago here. Hurricanes Lee and Margot together in the North Atlantic Basin, so an older satellite loop, do not be alarmed here. At the time, Lee was below its peak intensity, but did briefly attain Category 5 strength, while Margot was a drifter over the Central Atlantic, attaining high-end Category 1 status. So yet another time this season with two simultaneous hurricanes in the Atlantic Basin. This was a really fascinating satellite image of showing Lee on its way up towards New England and Atlantic Canada back over the weekend here. I believe this was on Friday morning, in fact, showing this kind of shadow imposed over places like Long Island and New York City by Hurricane Lee's cloud field as it was undergoing extratropical transition. You kind of see this asymmetry in where the kind of deeper, taller clouds are skewed off to the north and eventually to the west of the storm circulation. And even though this did not directly hit portions of New England, it still brought some pretty nasty weather to areas like Cape Cod and where Dana Osgood is out near Portland, Maine, for example, before bringing some more direct impacts, strong wind, some storm surge, and plenty of wave activity to portions of Atlantic Canada as well. And with all this activity, and particularly long-lived storms like Franklin and Lee, the accumulated cyclone energy, again, this kind of combined metric that accounts for the strength and the duration of tropical cyclones, is actually running quite a bit above average now. We're talking about this green shading here indicates the standard deviations, essentially. So kind of looking at some statistical measures here, showing that ACE is a pretty decent bit above our average, about 43 units above average at this point, ranking 15th in our 73-year kind of more established climatology, I would say. And interestingly, we're actually ranking just ahead of 2020, which you may remember as the storm or the season with 30 named storms. However, that season was notable for having a particularly impactful finish with some intense storms in October and November. So it seems likely that at this point, I'm not expecting 2023 to quite top those levels, unless we have some really crazy stuff going on late season. But counting the January subtropical storm, that's why I have named here in quotations as I have all along on Tropical Tracker, we're at 15 storms for the year, which is almost 5 to 6 more than our average across 1991 to 2020 here. So despite that El Nino, we are pretty much above average in any metric that you want to count. And one of the storms contributing to this is Hurricane Nigel. This is the current view from water vapor imagery here. Bit of a ragged but very large eye, measuring about 55 meters across, which is significantly larger than the average hurricane eye that you might see. And starting to kind of wrap around a little bit more symmetric of that deep convection activity in its eye wall. It has successfully closed off an eye wall, which may allow for some additional strengthening into a Category 2 or potentially even a low-end Category 3 hurricane before it eventually moves its way off to the northwest, encounters some drier air that you can see in the brown and orange light colors here, and then eventually interacts with this large frontal boundary, which even brought some cooler weather to my old home in Tallahassee, Florida, before this kind of curves off to the north, avoids Bermuda, thankfully, and should steer clear of any significant land masses. So that's Nigel's story. Looking over here towards Florida, because you don't see anything spinning and you don't see anything that looks particularly organized or primed to spin. But this is the next area we're going to be watching for the potential of a subtropical-like genesis event, essentially. We could be watching the coast off of Florida and the Carolinas here because we're going to have an area of disturbed weather, an area of low pressure that's expected to form off the Florida coast in the next few days. And then this part of the Atlantic Basin, the western Atlantic here, you have that Gulf Stream, this area of relatively warm sea surface temperatures compared to anywhere really off to its east, especially when you consider the cold wakes, the colder water left behind by storms like Idalia, Franklin, and Lee, of course. And because of this, model ensembles are picking up a signal for a potential subtropical genesis event here. And this could be, bring some squally weather to portions of the Carolinas coastline, something to look at up the East Coast a little bit as we go into the next few days. And this is the more aggressive of the ensembles. The European is not showing quite as many members developing into something. But what I'll go ahead and do now is step out of the way and show you this guy, because Cabo Verde season is not quite done yet. We have potential signal, in fact, a 70% chance of tropical cyclone development over the next week with this wave that's going to be exiting Africa in the next 24 to 48 hours. And what I'm going to show you here is actually a temperature map of Africa, because while that's not the main focus of this, I want to kind of explain what's going on with all these waves and why we look to August and September as the time when Atlantic hurricane activity is really supposed to pick up. Because you have these easterly waves that emerge off the African coast. When we think about jet streams in the kind of mid-latitudes where we are here in Pennsylvania, the reason that we have this kind of west to east flow aloft is because the temperatures down near the equator are so much warmer than what we see at the poles. There's this relationship in meteorology called thermal wind that basically suggests or dictates that your winds are going to get a lot stronger from west to east as you go up through the atmosphere. Here it's actually the opposite, because off to the north here of sub-Saharan Africa, we have the Sahara Desert, an area of extreme warmth, of course, that actually causes a reversed jet stream that blows from east to west and basically causes a sort of instability that pushes these waves out over Africa here. And we should start to see that jet weaken over the next few weeks as we go into October, but maybe another storm or two on the horizon before we say goodbye to Cabo Verde hurricane season and start to look back to the west for potential activity. Your forecast summary is coming up next.